When the wife pushed the millionaire husband in a wheelchair into the sea to take his fortune, she thought it was all over, but she didn't count on a homeless little girl finding the man adrift. Days later, this girl would do something so powerful that it would leave the wife in complete despair. Helen's proposal arrived with the softness of a morning breeze, but it carried the weight of an imminent storm. "A day just for us, Arthur, my love," she said. Her voice a carefully rehearsed velvet, just the sea, the sun, and our chance to reconnect. Seated in his wheelchair on the porch, from where he could see the distant shimmer of the ocean, Arthur felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. For the last few months, the connection between them had become a frayed, fragile thread, stretched to the breaking point. Their conversations were short, their touches rare, and her eyes always seemed to be gazing at something beyond him, something he couldn't reach. She had become an expert in smiles that offered no warmth and in kindnesses that sounded like veiled commands. He watched her as she packed a small wicker tote. Her movements were graceful, but there was a restrained urgency in each gesture, a rigidity in her shoulders that betrayed the calm of her words. Arthur, since the accident that had stolen the movement from his legs, had learned to read the world differently. Physical immobility had sharpened his perception of the nuances others ignored, the almost imperceptible tremor in a hand, the hesitation in a breath, the lie hiding in a diverted gaze. And in Helen, he saw an ocean of hidden intentions. He remembered the stacks of financial documents she would place on his desk, insisting he sign them without delay. "It's just red tape, darling, to make things easier," she'd say. But her patience evaporated quickly when he asked for time to read the fine print. "I don't know, Helen," he answered, his voice lower than he'd intended. "The sea looks a little rough today." It was a weak excuse, and they both knew it. He didn't fear the sea. He loved it. The sea was memory. It was the freedom his body no longer possessed. What he feared was the invisible current pulling him away from her, even when they were in the same room. He feared the reason behind this sudden invitation, this forced sweetness that smacked of strategy. The fear of being a burden, a dead weight in her vibrant life, was an anchor in his chest. Perhaps she was just trying one more time. And if he refused, it would be further proof that he was the problem, the obstacle to their happiness. "Don't be silly, Arthur," the harbour master said. "The weather is clearing up. It's going to be perfect." She came closer, kneeling beside his chair, and rested her hand on his knee. The touch was cold. "Please, for me." The plea, which once would have melted his heart, now sounded like the final piece of a puzzle he couldn't assemble. He sighed, a sound of surrender. Hope, that stubborn spark he refused to extinguish, whispered that maybe he was wrong. Perhaps this was the day the tide would finally turn in their favor. He agreed with a nod. Her smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. At the docks, their yacht, the Serenity, rocked gently on the water. Helen pushed him up the ramp with a strength that surprised him. Aboard, the scent of salt spray mingled with something metallic, an odor he couldn't quite place. As she busied herself untying one of the lines, Arthur's eyes scanned the deck. That's when he saw it. The small security camera installed near the cabin was aimed downward, and the little red light indicating it was active was off. He frowned. "Is the camera not working?" Helen turned, following his gaze. For a fraction of a second, he saw a flash of panic in her eyes before the mask of tranquility slipped back into place. "Oh, that must be a bad connection. I turned it off myself earlier to save the battery." The excuse was as flimsy as the smile that accompanied it, and for the first time that day, Arthur's vague discomfort morphed into a sharp, icy fear. Arthur tried to push the image of the dead camera from his mind, but it stuck there like a splinter. He wanted to believe her excuse, wanted desperately to cling to the possibility that his suspicion was just a ghost born of his own insecurity. Yet Helen's calm was as thin as a sheet of ice over deep, dark water. The yacht's engine rumbled to life, a familiar sound that today seemed ominous. and they slowly pulled away from the docks, leaving the safety of solid ground behind. Arthur looked at the coast, at the colorful houses shrinking with every second, feeling like a ship without an anchor, adrift on a sea of uncertainty. He knew these waters like the back of his hand. He knew the shape of the cliffs by heart, the position of the small islands, and the routes the tour boats usually took, seeking out the coves with calm, crystal-clear water. But Helen didn't follow that path. She turned the helm east, toward the open sea, where the coast was a rugged, wild line, and the waters deepened to a cobalt blue that swallowed the light. "Where are we going?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "I found a new spot," she answered, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "A hidden paradise, away from all the noise, just for us." The answer was poetic, but empty. Arthur felt the yacht's stronger sway, the hull protesting against the larger waves. This wasn't a place for a quiet outing. It was a place of isolation. He felt increasingly vulnerable, trapped in his chair, dependent on the very person who was filling him with a creeping dread. He remembered how she had helped him in the first years after the accident, with a dedication that seemed genuine. Where had that woman gone? Had it all been a performance? A long and patient wait for the right moment? She set the autopilot and approached him, carrying a tray with 2 tall glasses and a pitcher of deep red pomegranate juice. The sun hit the liquid, giving it an almost artificial sheen. "I made this for you. Your favorite." She handed him a glass. The smell was sweet, excessively so, with a strange note underneath, something he couldn't name. He looked at the glass, then at her eyes, which watched him with an eager intensity. His instincts, sharpened by a lifetime of negotiations and the vulnerability of his condition, screamed in silence. Patience, his old ally, advised him to watch. "Thank you, my dear, but I'm not thirsty right now." The refusal was gentle, but its effect on Helen was immediate. Her mask of serenity cracked for an instant. A flash of irritation crossed her face before being replaced by a forced smile. "Oh, all right. I'll just leave it here for when you are." She placed the glass on a small table beside him, but the gesture was rougher than necessary. She moved away, returning to the helm, and took out her phone. She turned her back to him, as if seeking privacy in the vast, empty ocean. Arthur strained his ears, catching fragments of a whisper. Her voice was low, urgent. He could only make out disjointed phrases, carried away by the wind. "No, he hasn't yet," followed by an impatient pause. And then, the words that froze the blood in his veins sounded crystal clear for a second. "I have until this afternoon to take care of it." She hung up abruptly, pocketing the device. The silence that followed was filled only by the sound of the waves and the frantic beating of Arthur's heart. He looked at the untouched glass, at the deep sea around them, and at the back of the woman he had once loved. There was no longer any doubt. This wasn't a day trip. It was a trap. Take care of it. The 4 words echoed in Arthur's mind, louder than the yacht's engine, vaster than the ocean around him. Betrayal was no longer a suspicion, a shadow in the corner of his eye. It was a solid, cold certainty that had settled in his chest, weighing more than the uselessness of his legs. He looked at Helen, who still had her back to him, and saw her not as his wife, but as a stranger, a predator who had led him away from the herd for the kill. The sea breeze, which once brought him peace, now seemed to carry the whisper of her plans. Every wave that crashed against the hull of the Serenity sounded like a countdown to an end he didn't dare fully imagine. Fear was a living thing inside him, but beneath it, a current of fury began to form. Fury at his own naivety, at the blind trust he had placed in her for so long. She turned, the rehearsed smile back in place. But her eyes couldn't hide the tension. They were like 2 closed windows to a dark house. "The weather's turning, isn't it?" she commented, glancing at a few clouds gathering on the horizon. The question, heavy with double meaning, sent a shiver through him. He didn't answer, just continued to stare at her, letting the silence be his weapon. His patience, once a passive virtue, had become a shield. He needed time. He needed to understand the depth of the abyss that had opened between them. "You're so quiet, Arthur. Aren't you enjoying our trip?" She pushed, her voice laced with a thread of irritation. "Or maybe you're just tired. Too tired for these things." The insinuation was cruel, a poisoned needle aimed at the most sensitive part of his soul, the fear of being a burden. He remembered the day they met, at a charity regatta. Her laugh was infectious. The way the sunlight played in her hair had enchanted him. He had fallen in love with the woman who seemed to see past the wheelchair, who saw the man he was. Had it all been a mirage? A long, elaborate play where he was the only one in the audience who didn't know the script. Shame burned inside him, hotter than fear. The shame of being so easily fooled, of having mistaken greed for love. "What do you want, Helen?" he asked, his voice firm, cutting through the air like a knife. The direct question caught her off guard. The mask dropped for a second, revealing a hard, impatient face. "What do I want? I want you to stop being an obstacle, Arthur. To yourself. To me." She gestured at the sea around them. "Look at all this. We could be enjoying life, traveling, but you prefer to stay locked up, reading your papers, suspicious of everything." The accusation was a perverse inversion of reality. It was she who isolated him, who managed his visitors, who filtered his calls. It was she who lived impatiently, her eyes fixed on the fortune he had built over a lifetime of work. The yacht lurched, hit by an unexpected wave. A plate slid off the small table and shattered on the deck. The sharp sound broke the tension, but only for a second. Helen didn't flinch. Instead, a strange glint lit up in her eyes. She looked at the choppy sea, then at him, his wheelchair dangerously close to the rail. "Sometimes," she said, her voice low and sharp, "a little push is all we need to move on, don't you think?" She walked slowly toward him, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. The smile had vanished completely, replaced by a cold determination that promised the end of everything. Her question wasn't a metaphor. The push she mentioned was literal, a cold promise hanging in the salt-filled air. Arthur felt his blood run cold, but his mind, accustomed to analyzing scenarios and calculating risks, worked at high speed. He could not give in to panic. He gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white, trying to use what little leverage he had to stay stable. "Helen, stop," he said, his voice surprisingly calm, "an island of reason in a sea of madness. Whatever you're planning, it won't work. People know we're out here. There are logs." He was trying to appeal to her logic, to the calculating woman he now saw clearly. But logic had already abandoned this boat. Her eyes shone with a fever of greed and impatience, a fire that had consumed any remnant of affection or humanity. "Logs," she scoffed, the sound harsh and ugly. "Logs of a romantic trip, of a depressed husband who, in a moment of despair, committed a tragic act. It's a sad story, Arthur. People will weep for me." Every word was a blow, dismantling his reality piece by piece. The chasm between the memory of the woman he loved and the monstrous figure before him was vast and uncrossable. He saw the entire plan unfold in his mind. The staged grief, the crocodile tears, the takeover of his empire. The yacht rocked again, harder this time. It was the opportunity she had been waiting for. With a swift, brutal movement, she lunged forward. It wasn't a violent shove, but a precise, calculated push, using the sea's momentum to her advantage. He tried to scream, but the sound was trapped in his throat. He tried to turn the wheels, but his hands slipped. The world tilted violently. For an instant, he saw the blue sky and white clouds upside down. The wheelchair, which had been his prison and his extension for so many years, became an accomplice to the betrayal, its metal weight dragging him toward the edge. The sound of metal scraping against the deck was the last thing he heard before the deafening silence of the plunge. The impact stole his breath. The icy water was a brutal shock, a mortal embrace that engulfed him completely, invading his clothes, his lungs, his senses. The salt burned in his open eyes, turning the underwater world into a blur of light and darkness. The instinct to survive, a stubborn flame, made him fight. He flailed his arms, trying to reach the surface, but his legs, useless on land, were now anchors pulling him down. The weight of the chair, which had broken free from him on impact, was sinking into the depths like a metal ghost, a reminder of his vulnerability. With a superhuman effort, he managed to thrust his torso upward. His head broke the surface. He choked, sputtering salt water, the air searing his lungs like fire. He looked desperately toward the yacht. Helen was there, standing at the rail, a silhouette against the sky. She wasn't screaming for help. She wasn't moving to throw him a lifebuoy. She was just watching him, her face a mask of cold satisfaction. Their eyes met for one long, terrible second. In that gaze, he saw the end of everything, of love, of trust, of the life they had built together. Then she turned slowly and walked toward the helm. The sound of the engine revved higher, a roar that sealed his fate. The serenity began to pull away, leaving him alone in the blue vastness, a small, insignificant speck of humanity fighting the waves, with the echo of his life's greatest betrayal dissolving in the wind. The loneliness that descended upon Arthur was deeper and colder than the ocean itself. The drone of the Serenity's engine grew fainter, a cruel murmur fading into the horizon until only the sound of the waves and his own ragged, gasping breath remained. Despair was a violent tide, threatening to drown him from the inside. Every muscle in his body protested the cold, and the fight to keep his head above water was an exhausting battle. His legs, which he could barely feel, were a dead weight. A betrayal by his own body compounding Helen's. He thought about giving up, about simply letting the water take him. It would be easy. One last breath, and the suffering would end. But then, an image flashed in his mind. Helen's face, serene and victorious, inheriting everything he had ever built. The injustice of it ignited an ember of rage in his despair. No, he would not give her that victory. He began to swim, or rather to haul himself through the water using only his arms. Each stroke was a Herculean effort. The coast was a thin, distant line, an unreachable mirage. Time lost all meaning. Minutes stretched into an eternity of effort and pain. The sun began to dip in the sky, painting the sea in hues of orange and purple, an ironic beauty for the scene of his possible death. Just as exhaustion was about to claim him, as his arms refused to obey, he saw something floating a few yards away. It was a piece of wood, part of a crate or some flotsam, covered in seaweed. It was small, but it was hope. He paddled toward it with the last of his strength, clinging to the rough surface as if his life depended on it, because it did. The small, makeshift buoy didn't fully support him, but it eased the strain on his arms, allowing him to float with less effort. Meanwhile, not far away, on a hidden beach behind an old, abandoned pier, a small figure moved among the debris washed in by the high tide. It was Leah, a girl of about 10, wiry, with dark hair tangled with salt and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of a lifetime. She had no home, no family, only the sea as her provider and companion. The fishermen knew her. Some gave her a fish. Others ignored her. She lived in a world of her own, built from the scraps the ocean offered her. That afternoon, she was looking for pieces of driftwood good enough to trade for a little food. It was then that her sharp eyes, accustomed to scanning the horizon, noticed a dark spot bobbing in the distance. Something that didn't look like ordinary wreckage. It seemed to move, to struggle. Curious, she climbed onto a pile of rocks for a better view. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. A spark of something powerful lit inside her. Since she was little, Leah had listened to the old fishermen's stories about the sea. They said the sea was fair. It took, but it also gave back. It gave back lost objects, bountiful catches, and sometimes it gave back chances. She had always believed it. She believed that even though she had nothing, one day the sea would give her a chance to offer something valuable. And there it was, a life adrift. Without hesitating, she ran to her small hideout under the pier, a cramped space filled with her treasures, old ropes, torn nets, and a block of styrofoam that had once been part of a buoy. She grabbed the strongest rope she had and tied one end to the styrofoam and the other to a piece of wood that would serve as a spool. It was a makeshift rescue tool, precarious, but it was all she had. With a determination that would put any adult to shame, she returned to the water's edge, ready to prove to herself that the sea did, in fact, give chances to those who knew how to seize them. Casting the styrofoam out toward Arthur was the hardest part. The wind blew against her, and the waves stubbornly washed her improvised life raft back to shore. Leah didn't give up. The image of that person fighting for their life drove her with a force she didn't know she possessed. She remembered Sal, an old beachcomber who was her only friend, teaching her how to read the currents. "The sea has pathways, kid," he'd say. "You just got to learn to see 'em." She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the direction of the wind on her face, watching the pattern of the waves breaking on the beach. She waited for the right moment, a brief lull between two larger swells, and hurled the styrofoam with all her might. This time, it flew farther, landing in the water at a decent distance. The current, once her enemy, now became her ally, carrying the small buoy closer to the dark shape. Arthur barely noticed the white object floating toward him. His vision was blurry. The cold had numbed his thoughts. He was in a state of semi-consciousness, his body acting on pure instinct while his mind drifted between memories and despair. It was the gentle tug of the rope brushing against his arm that roused him. He blinked, focusing his eyes with difficulty. He saw the styrofoam and the rope stretching toward the shore. He looked in that direction and saw a tiny silhouette on the sand, waving at him. A child. It seemed impossible, but hope, however small, was a warmth that spread through his frozen chest. He reached out a trembling hand and grabbed the rope. The pull from the other end was surprisingly strong, steady. The battle began. Leah pulled with the weight of her wiry body, her bare feet digging into the wet sand for leverage. Arthur, on the other end, helped as he could, using his arms to pull himself along the rope. Progress was slow, agonizing. Every foot gained felt like a mile. The sun had now set, and twilight painted the world in shades of gray and deep blue. Leah could no longer see the man's face, only the dark form that grew closer with each pull. Her arms ached, her muscles burned, but she didn't think of stopping. This was her chance. The chance to do something that mattered. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, Arthur's feet scraped the bottom. The water was now at his waist. Leah ran into the surf, the cold water rising to her knees, and helped drag him out. He collapsed onto the sand, exhausted, shaking uncontrollably, a heap of drenched clothes and desperation. Leah watched him for a moment, her heart pounding. The man looked rich. His clothes, though ruined, were fine. He wore a gold watch, now tarnished by the salt. Anyone else on this beach might have thought of robbing him, but Leah saw only a broken man, saved by the sea she so respected. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice little more than a whisper. Arthur coughed, spitting up more salt water. He lifted his head and looked at the girl. His eyes, despite the exhaustion and trauma, still held their lifelong sharpness. He saw the strength and kindness in that small figure. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice hoarse. You saved my life." He needed help, a safe place, but the fear of Helen paralyzed him. If someone saw him, if word of his survival reached her, she would come back to finish the job. Leah noticed the hesitation, the fear in his eyes. She didn't ask questions. In her world, people often had reasons to hide. "Come on," she said. "I know a place. No one will find you there." She knew she would need help to move him. Her thoughts flew to Sal, the beachcomber. He was a man of few words and many scars, but his heart was as vast as the ocean. He would help her. No questions asked. Sal found them in the growing dusk, his tall, stooped frame, shaped by years of hauling bags of recyclables, cast a long shadow on the sand. He approached in silence, his eyes surveying the scene with a calm that came from having seen nearly everything life on the margins could offer. Leah ran to him, the words tumbling out in a rush. "He needs help. Sal, he was in the water. He's cold." The old man didn't answer right away. He knelt beside Arthur, the scent of salt and wood smoke clinging to his worn clothes. His calloused fingers touched Arthur's forehead, checking his temperature. He didn't ask how a well-dressed man had ended up here, on the brink of death. Misery had many faces, and he had learned not to question the stories the sea washed ashore. With a grunt of effort, Sal slung one of Arthur's arms over his shoulders while Leah supported the other side. Together, the three of them formed a strange procession, moving slowly away from the beach toward a labyrinth of shanties and makeshift shelters. Sal's hideout was a small room built from salvaged lumber and corrugated tin, squeezed between an abandoned warehouse and the seawall. Inside it, however, it was surprisingly neat and clean. A small fire crackled in a metal drum in the center, spreading welcome warmth and a flickering light that danced on the walls. They laid Arthur on an old but clean mattress covered with rough blankets. Leah brought a tin mug of steaming hot tea, made from herbs she gathered herself. The warm liquid slid down Arthur's throat, chasing away some of the chill that had settled in his bones. He watched the two of them in silence, gratitude mingling with a rising anguish. He was alive, but he was a fugitive. He was safe for now, but the world outside believed him dead, and Helen, his Helen, was free to act. As Sal tended the fire, Leah sat on a wooden crate near Arthur. "The sea gave you back," she said, with the simplicity of someone stating a universal truth. "It does that sometimes." The girl's words, filled with an ancient, pure faith, struck Arthur in an unexpected way. He had always been a man of logic, of numbers and contracts. But here, in this shanty, warmed by the fire and the care of two strangers, he felt the power of that belief. The sea had given him back, but for what? For a life of hiding, of fear. The image of Helen returned to haunt him. He had to know what she was doing. The weakness of his body was a cage, but his mind was clear, sharpened by adrenaline and rage. "I need a favor," he said to Leah, his voice still weak. "A big one. I need you to go to the main docks tomorrow morning. Just watch, listen to the chatter. I want to know what they're saying about the yacht Serenity." Leah nodded, her eyes serious. She understood the language of secrets. Living on the streets had taught her to be invisible, to listen without being noticed. It was a mission, and she would carry it out with the same determination she had used to save him. The night passed slowly. Arthur barely slept. Nightmares of icy water and Helen's cold face assaulting him whenever he closed his eyes. The next morning, Leah left before sunrise. Hours later, she returned, her face pale, breathless from running. She stopped at the entrance to the shanty, her eyes wide. "They found the boat," she said, her voice trembling. "Empty, and your wife. She's there, at the docks, crying, telling everyone it was a terrible accident, that you're gone." The news hit Arthur like a punch. He had expected it, but hearing the confirmation, seeing the performance begin, was sickening. But what Leah said next changed everything. "And there's something else," she continued, hesitant. Her tone, it's strange. She doesn't just sound sad. She sounds scared. She told one of the dockhands that she needs to make sure nobody finds out you're alive. Yet. The word yet hung in the air, loaded with a sinister and revealing meaning. Helen wasn't sure of her success. She knew there was a chance he had survived, and that knowledge terrified her. Suddenly, Arthur was no longer just a victim. He was a threat, a ghost who could come back to haunt her, and he realized with shocking clarity that while he was hiding, she would be hunting him. Leah's revelation transformed Arthur's fear into something sharper, more dangerous, strategic caution. The game had changed. He was no longer just a man adrift, but a living piece on a board Helen believed she had cleared. That word, yet, was the key. It meant she wasn't certain of his death. It meant that behind the false tears and staged despair, there was a nervous hunter, looking over her shoulder, waiting for the ghost of her betrayal to emerge from the water. The shame he'd felt for his naivety began to give way to a cold resolve. Shame wouldn't help him survive. Intelligence would. He had to turn his greatest weakness, his supposed death, into his greatest strength. While the world mourned him, he could watch, plan I, and most importantly, understand the full extent of Helen's scheme. The following days crawled by in a routine of secrecy and recovery. Sal, with his silent wisdom, tended to Arthur's basic needs. He brought food, thin soup, stale bread, but to Arthur it was a feast, changed the makeshift bandages on his scrapes, and kept the fire going. He never asked questions about Arthur's past, merely accepting his presence as he accepted the tides. It was a pact of silence, a solidarity born of hardship. Leah became his eyes and ears. Every morning, she would slip into the bustling areas of the docks, blending into the crowds, her small size and humble appearance rendering her invisible. She returned with fragments of information, small pieces of a dark puzzle. She told him of Helen's performance for the local news, her face veiled in black, her voice breaking as she spoke of the love of her life and the tragic accident. She said, "You'd been very sad lately," Leah reported one day, perched on her crate, her eyes locked on Arthur's. "Said you didn't want to live anymore, that the sea called to you." The lie was so vile, so calculated, that Arthur tasted bitter bile in his mouth. Helen wasn't just getting rid of him, she was murdering his memory, painting him as a weak, hopeless man. A narrative that would justify his suicide and clear her of any suspicion. Arthur's internal conflict deepened. The fragility of his body was a constant reality. Without his wheelchair, he was completely dependent on Sal and Leah to move. He felt powerless, a chained giant. The shame of having trusted Helen was a throbbing wound, more painful than any physical injury. How could he have been so blind? How could he have mistaken her ambition for affection for so long? Leah, with her childlike sensitivity, seemed to sense the darkness gathering in him. She tried, in her own way, to restore his hope. She brought him oddly shaped shells, told him fishermen's tales of sea monsters and hidden treasures. One afternoon, as Arthur stared into the fire, lost in grim thoughts, she came closer. "Sal says the sea tests you," she whispered. "It cuts your anchors to see if you know how to swim. You know how to swim, right?" The simple question hit him with force. He had always known how to swim in the world of business, in life. He had weathered crises, recessions, betrayals from partners, but now the metaphor was literal. He was swimming for his very life, in waters far more dangerous than any boardroom. The girl was right. The sea was testing him, and he couldn't let himself drown in self-pity. "Yes, Leah," he answered, his voice firmer than it had been in days. "I know how to swim." In that moment, the decision was made. He would not stay here, hiding, waiting for Helen to find him or for time to erase his existence. He would fight back, but to fight, he needed weapons, and his weapons were information, documents, proof. They had to be somewhere, and he suspected the first place to look was the one place Helen now considered safe, the yacht Serenity. The idea of returning to the Serenity was both terrifying and necessary. The yacht was the scene of the crime, the place where his life had nearly ended. The mere mention of its name brought back the sensation of the icy water and Helen's vacant stare. But Arthur knew, with the certainty of a strategist, that people often grow careless at the epicenter of their own lies. Helen believed the boat was a shrine to her narrative, a monument to her false grief. She would never imagine that he, the ghost, would dare to return. He shared his plan with Leah and Sal. The old man listened in silence, his weathered face unreadable in the firelight. Leah, on the other hand, had eyes shining with excitement and danger. To her, it was another adventure, a mission the sea had given her. "Too risky," Sal finally said, his voice as gravelly as shifting stones. "The woman's all over the news. The docks are crawling with curious people." "That's why we have to go at night," Arthur countered, his mind already working through the details. "During the shift change for the dock security, Leah, you said there's a blind spot near the old net shed where there are no lights." Leah confirmed with a vigorous nod. She knew every shadow, every crevice of that place. The plan was simple in its audacity. Sal would use his small fishing boat, a battered old skiff, to approach the yacht from the sea, where surveillance was lighter. Leah, agile and small, would climb aboard to search for anything Helen might have left behind. Arthur would stay in Sal's boat, coordinating the operation, his brain the only part of his body functioning at full capacity. He gave Leah precise instructions. Look for documents, a second phone, anything out of place. He described a secret compartment in the cabin floor, under a rug, where he used to keep important papers. The next night, a thin fog rolled in from the water, a perfect veil for their clandestine operation. Sal's skiff glided silently through the dark water, the motor off, propelled only by the oars the old fisherman expertly handled. They reached the Serenity, which looked like a slumbering, ghostly giant in the dim moonlight. Leah, dressed in dark clothes, was a nimble shadow. She scaled the anchor line with the ease of a squirrel and disappeared onto the deck. For Arthur, the wait was agony. Every sound, the creak of a rope, the cry of a night gull, made his heart pound. He was back at the site of his near death, vulnerable, dependent on the courage of a child. Minutes passed that felt like hours. Finally, Leah's small shadow reappeared at the rail, waving to them. When she slipped back into Sal's skiff, she was carrying a leather briefcase that Arthur recognized immediately. It was one he hadn't seen in months, one Helen had claimed was lost during a clean-out. Arthur's heart raced. Leah was also holding a small metal object. "It was under her bed," the girl whispered, handing it to him. It was a flash drive. Back in the safety of the shanty, the trembling firelight illuminated their find. Arthur opened the briefcase. Inside, stacks of documents. They were copies of his investments, altered bank statements, and, most damningly, drafted power of attorney forms that gave Helen total control over his assets. With spaces for a signature he had never provided. They were dated weeks before the accident. The premeditation was clear, undeniable. As he sifted through the papers, Sal, who had an old laptop powered by a car battery, managed to plug in the flash drive. The screen lit up, revealing a single password-protected folder. Arthur felt a chill. He tried a few obvious passwords, with no success. Frustration gnawed at him. The truth was right there, a click away, but locked tight. It was Leah, watching over his shoulder, who pointed at the screen. "Try the boat's name," she said, "but backwards." Arthur frowned, but typed "Wittineers." The folder opened, and what they saw on the screen made everyone's blood run cold. It was emails, dozens of them, between Helen and a lawyer, detailing step-by-step how to have Arthur declared mentally incompetent, using his physical condition as a pretext to have him legally institutionalized. The original plan wasn't to kill him, but to bury him alive. The boat trip had just been Plan B, a faster, more desperate solution. The silence that followed the revelation of the emails was heavier than any words. In the small shanty, the only light came from the laptop screen and the dancing glow of the fire, which cast long, trembling shadows on the walls, making the three of them look like conspirators in some ancient, dark tale. Sal, who had maintained a neutral expression until now, clenched his fists on his knees, a vein pulsing in his temple. Leah stared at the screen with wide eyes, her childhood innocence colliding with the calculated, adult evil she read between the lines of those messages. But it was in Arthur that the transformation was most profound. The pain of the physical betrayal, of the push to his death, was an open wound. But this was different. This was a slow poison. An attempt to assassinate him from the inside, to erase his mind, his identity, his legacy. Declared incompetent, he would have been a prisoner in his own home, a puppet whose strings Helen would pull at her leisure. The fury he felt was cold and precise. The self-pity, the fear of his own frailty, all of it dissolved, replaced by a clarity of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't a burden. He was a king whose throne was being usurped, and he would not allow it. "She's more desperate than I thought," Arthur said, his voice low but resonating with a new authority. "Her plan to have me committed failed because I stalled on signing the papers. Her plan to drown me. She's not sure it worked. That puts her in a terrible position. She's a cornered animal." He looked at Leah and Sal, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he felt a wave of protective responsibility for them. They had saved him, taken him in, and now, because of him, they were in the sights of a dangerous and unpredictable woman. The risk is greater now, for all of us. As long as she's not sure I'm dead, she won't stop looking. The next morning, the atmosphere was charged with a new urgency. Leah set out for the docks, no longer as a passive observer, but as a spy in enemy territory. She moved more carefully, the shadows her allies. The conversations she overheard that day confirmed Arthur's worst fears. The talk among the fishermen and shopkeepers was of a generous reward. Helen, the poor, devastated widow, was offering a large sum of cash to anyone who found any trace of her beloved husband. The offer was publicly framed as a search for closure, a desire to have a body to mourn. But Leah, with the wisdom life had given her, understood the truth. It wasn't a search for a body, it was a hunt for a survivor. Anyone living on the margins, anyone who might have seen something, was now a potential informant. Helen's generosity was a net cast over the water and the streets, and they were caught right in the middle of it. Leah ran back, her heart hammering. She told Arthur and Sal about the reward, about how people's eyes lit up with greed when they talked about the money. The hideout, which had once felt like a sanctuary, suddenly felt like a fragile cage. Any neighbor, any acquaintance could be tempted to talk. The danger was no longer a distant possibility, it was a real and imminent presence. As dusk fell, the orange light filtering through the cracks in the shanty, Leah went out to fetch some water from a nearby spigot. It was on her way back, rounding a cluster of old shipping containers, that she froze. A man in a dark suit, impeccably dressed, was standing there, less than 50 yards from Sal's hideout. He did not belong there. His presence was as out of place as an orchid in a swamp. He was talking to another homeless man, showing him a photo on his phone. Even from a distance, Leah recognized the face in the picture. It was Arthur. The man in the suit was one of Helen's security guards, one she had seen from afar near the mansion. She shrank into the shadow of a rusted container, her heart pounding against her ribs. The hunt had come to their door. The air in Leah's lungs froze. The man in the suit was a wolf, and her pack, her small, fragile sanctuary, was moments from being discovered. Panic rose in her throat like a wave. But years of surviving on the streets had taught her to swallow it, to turn it into action. Running back to the shanty was impossible. The man would see her, and the path would lead him right to them. She needed a diversion, a noise, something to draw the wolf away from the den. Her eyes scanned the debris-strewn alley, searching for a weapon. She found one, a rickety pile of empty metal drums, stacked precariously next to a crumbling wall on the far side of the alley. It was perfect. Heart hammering, she moved through the shadows, circling the scene, putting herself on the opposite side of the guard. She picked up a loose rock, feeling its rough weight in her small hand. She took a deep breath, aimed for the base of the drum pile, and threw with all her might. The impact was louder than she'd expected. The drums crashed down with a deafening metallic roar, a thunderclap of rust that echoed through the quiet alley, sending a panicked flock of pigeons into the air. The guard and the man he was talking to spun around, startled by the noise. "What was that?" the guard demanded, his hand instinctively going to his jacket, where he likely kept a weapon. He took a few hesitant, suspicious steps in the direction of the sound. It was Leah's chance. While the hunter's attention was diverted, she slipped back through the shadows, running silently, her bare feet barely touching the packed dirt. She burst into Sal's shanty like a phantom, chest heaving, her eyes wide with terror. "They're here!" she whispered, her voice cracking. "A man from your wife. He's right outside, showing your picture. He almost saw us." The news landed like a death sentence in the small room. Sal shot to his feet, his usual calm replaced by high alert, dousing the fire with a bucket of sand and plunging the space into darkness. Arthur felt a chill that wasn't from the lack of fire. It was the chill of failure, of guilt. He had endangered them. This brave girl and this kind old man were risking their lives for him. His rage at Helen mingled with a deep, aching sense of responsibility. "It's my fault," he said into the darkness, his voice heavy with remorse. "I never should have involved you in this." Sal placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder, a rare and powerful gesture. "You didn't involve us in anything," the old man said, his voice firm. "The sea brought you. We just took what it gave us. But the kid's right, they've found us. We can't stay here." The reality was undeniable. They needed a new refuge, a place where not even Helen's greed could reach them. Arthur's mind, used to thinking in terms of properties, luxury hotels and corporate safe houses, was blank. All of his solutions belonged to a world that no longer existed for him. Right now, he wasn't a millionaire with endless resources. He was just a crippled man, dependent on the wisdom of his saviors. "Where?" Arthur asked, desperation coloring his voice. "Where can we go?" The silence stretched for a long moment, broken only by Leah's anxious breathing. Then Sal spoke, his voice sounding like an ancient decree. "There is a place the sea hides and reveals every day, a place most people are afraid to even mention. We're going to the Silent Grotto." The name made Leah catch her breath. The Silent Grotto was more than a place. It was a local legend. A sea cave at the base of the cliffs that was only accessible during the day's lowest tide, and was said to swallow forever those who didn't respect its timing. Taking a man who couldn't walk there wasn't a plan. It was an impossible bet against the ocean itself. The bet against the ocean began in the darkest hour of the night, just before the tide hit its lowest point. Under a moonless sky shrouded in heavy clouds, the escape felt like an act of blind faith. Sal moved with the precision of someone who knew every rock and tide pool on this coastline as extensions of his own body. Leah, despite her fear of the Silent Grotto, became a nimble shadow, carrying the briefcase with the documents and the laptop, the treasures that represented Arthur's only chance at justice. The greatest challenge was moving Arthur. Sal had fashioned a kind of stretcher from 2 old oars and a piece of reinforced fishing net. It was a slow, arduous, and painful transport. Every jolt over the slick rocks was agony for Arthur, a cruel reminder of his complete dependence. Humiliation and gratitude waged a silent war within him. They moved along the base of the cliff, where waves broke with a deep, resonant boom. The air was thick with salt and the smell of seaweed. The grotto's entrance was a dark slash in the rocks. nearly invisible in the gloom, a tear in the stone that looked like the mouth of a sleeping creature. Water still covered the entrance, reaching Sal's knees. "We have to go now," he said, his voice muffled by the roar of the sea. "The tide will start to rise in less than an hour." The inside of the grotto was cold and damp, the sound of the sea transformed into a hollow, ghostly echo. Sal lit an oil lantern, revealing a space larger than it appeared from the outside, with a sandy floor and a higher stone ledge at the back that remained dry even at high tide. They settled Arthur there, exhausted. Outside, the sound of the waves began to change, growing closer, stronger. The tide was turning. They were safe, but they were also trapped, prisoners of this natural sanctuary until the next low tide. Meanwhile, in the world above, Helen's frustration was reaching a boiling point. The guard she'd sent returned empty-handed, talking of a false alarm and a dead end. The reward had produced no solid leads, only rumors and extortion attempts. The uncertainty was eating away at her. The possibility that Arthur was alive, hiding, watching her, was a waking nightmare. She needed a stronger alibi, something to cement her story and give her the control she craved. Her calculating mind found the solution: a memorial service for Arthur, a public event at the marina in front of the Serenity. It would be the final performance of the grieving widow. She would invite the press, friends, business partners. Before everyone, she would mourn her loss, speak of her undying love, and subtly reinforce the narrative of the sad, depressed man. It would be her coronation as the guardian of his legacy and, by extension, his fortune. The event was set for 2 days later, on the 10th day since Arthur's disappearance. In the grotto, Leah managed to pick up a faint radio signal on Sal's old transistor. They heard the news about the service. Helen's audacity was breathtaking. Arthur listened to the details of her plan, not with anger, but with an icy calm. This was it. This was the stage. The final confrontation wouldn't happen in a courtroom or a lawyer's office. It would happen here, in public, where her mask would be hardest to maintain. An idea began to form in his mind, a gamble as risky as their escape to the grotto, but one that could expose the truth in a way no document ever could. He looked over at Leah, who was sitting nearby, cleaning a small object she had pocketed from the yacht and kept with her ever since. It was one of the gold-crested metal buttons from the blazer Helen had worn on that fateful day. Arthur recognized it. It must have come loose during their silent struggle on the deck, just before he went over. He took the button from Leah's hand, the metal cool against his skin. It was small, insignificant, but it was physical proof of her presence and her actions. And suddenly, he knew exactly what to do. "Leah," he said, his voice vibrating with a new intensity, "I have one last thing to ask of you, the most important thing of all." The 10th day dawned grey and oppressive, the sky a blanket of clouds that seemed to mirror the staged morning on shore. At the marina, a small stage had been set up in front of the Serenity, which was docked and immaculate, a silent, complicit witness. Helen, dressed in black from head to toe, received guests with a perfectly studied expression of grief, her eyes moist and her touch, with hands cold and trembling, conveying a calculated fragility. Local news cameras recorded every embrace, every word of comfort. She was the picture of tragedy, the widow forsaken by fate and the sea. Meanwhile, in the silent grotto, the low tide granted them a window. Sal readied his fishing boat, but this time their destination was the busiest part of the docks. Arthur, dressed in simple clothes borrowed from Sal, was carefully placed in the bottom of the boat, covered by an old tarp. The journey was tense, every passing boat a potential threat. Leah was not with them. She had left earlier, on foot, the small metal button tucked in her pocket and Arthur's instructions echoing in her mind. She blended into the crowd that was gathering to watch the service, her small stature making her once again invisible. She watched Helen on the stage. the woman who had nearly killed her friend, and felt a knot of fear and determination in her stomach. Helen's speech began, her voice breaking as she spoke of Arthur as a wonderful but tormented man. She painted a picture of a distant husband, lost in his own sadness, a soul the sea had finally claimed. He found the peace on the water that he could no longer find on land, she said, dabbing at a non-existent tear. And though my heart is broken, I understand. I forgive him. The hypocrisy was so thick, Leah felt sick. It was time. With her heart pounding, she began to move through the crowd, weaving her way forward with the agility of a fish in a current. She reached the edge of the stage, just as Helen took a dramatic pause, gazing out at the sea. "Excuse me, ma'am." Leah's voice rang out, small but clear in the sudden silence. Every head turned toward her. Helen looked down, the irritation on her face at being interrupted quickly morphing into confusion. "I think this is yours," Leah continued, her hand outstretched, her open palm revealing the golden button. "It fell off on the boat that day." For an instant, the world seemed to stop. Helen stared at the button, the family crest gleaming in the flat light. She recognized it instantly. It was from the blazer she had worn, a blazer that no one but Arthur had seen her wear that day. The color drained from her face. How could this street urchin have it? If the button was here, it meant someone had found it on the boat, someone who had seen her. The mask of the grieving widow shattered. Pure, uncontrolled panic flooded her eyes. Where did you get that?" she stammered, her voice suddenly shrill. "A friend gave it to me," Leah answered with devastating simplicity. A murmur went through the crowd. The scene was strange, unsettling. The woman paled, trembled, lost control. It was at that exact moment that movement on the main ramp leading to the docks drew everyone's attention. Sal was pushing a borrowed wheelchair, and seated in it, pale, thinner, but with eyes blazing with an unbreakable intensity, was Arthur. A collective gasp swept through the crowd, a wave of shock and disbelief. Helen turned and saw him. Her scream was a strangled, guttural sound, a mix of terror and defeat. Arthur stopped in front of the stage, his gaze locked on hers. He didn't need to say a word about what she had done. His presence there, alive, was the final accusation. "Helen," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of 10 days of hell. "I was never lost, but I think you were, a long time ago." In front of dozens of witnesses and the cameras that were now frantically turning to her, Helen's lie crumbled to dust. She was exposed, not by documents or lawyers, but by the courage of a little girl and the resilience of a man everyone thought was dead. His return was not just the revelation of a truth, but the embodiment of justice that, like the sea, sometimes gives back what was taken. Helen's collapse wasn't loud. It was a silent, total crumbling, like a sandcastle swallowed by the tide. Faced with her living husband, the girl with the button, and the collective gaze of a crowd that had shifted from compassion to suspicion in the blink of an eye. All her strength deserted her. She didn't scream, didn't defend herself, didn't try to run. She just stood there, exposed under the grey sky, the mask of grief melting away to reveal the emptiness beneath. The cameras, once her allies in building the charade, now became her executioners, capturing the panic in her eyes, the trembling of her lips. Without a word, she turned, descended the stage steps with the stiffness of a porcelain doll, and walked, floated, through the crowd that parted for her like the sea. No one touched her. No one said a word. The silent contempt of hundreds was its own sentence. She got into her car and drove away, vanishing from Arthur's life and from that town forever, leaving behind nothing but the echo of her lies. Arthur didn't watch her go. His eyes were on Leah and Sal, in front of everyone. He reached out his hand to the girl, who approached shyly. He held it tightly. "This girl," he said, his voice clear and strong, projected for all to hear. "And this man," He gestured to Sal, who stood beside him like a rock, taught me something that all my money could never buy. They taught me that the value of a life isn't in what you have, but in what you offer. They offered me my life back, and that makes them the richest family I know. In that moment, the burden he had carried for so long, the fear of being a weight, simply evaporated. He wasn't weak. He was a survivor. His strength wasn't in his legs, but in his resilient heart and his ability to see the good where no one else looked. In the days that followed, the mansion on the hill, once a silent palace of loneliness and suspicion, began to fill with life. The doors, once closed to the world, were opened. Arthur made Sal an offer not of employment, but of partnership. He would be the caretaker of the house and grounds, not as a servant, but as a friend, with a place to live in dignity and peace for the rest of his days. To Leah, Arthur offered the world, not with money, but with opportunity. He enrolled her in the best school in town, turning one of the mansion's rooms into a library just for her, filled with books about oceans and stars and adventures. He was no longer her protected. He became her protector, her mentor, the father she never had. The girl who once read the world in the tides now read it in the pages of books. But she never lost the wisdom the sea had taught her. One sunny afternoon, exactly 1 month after his return, Arthur was on the same porch where it all began. The yacht Serenity had been renamed Gratitude and donated to a charity that taught underprivileged youth how to sail. Sitting in his chair, he watched the ocean. The sea before him was the same, but he was a completely different man. He heard the sound of Leah's laughter as she ran through the garden with Sal, trying to catch a butterfly. He was no longer alone. The sea had taken his mobility and nearly taken his life. But in its mysterious and relentless justice, the sea had also given him back everything that mattered. A purpose, the ability to trust, and a family forged not by blood, but by courage, kindness, and an old rope tossed at just the right moment. He finally understood. True wealth wasn't what you accumulated, but what you shared, and in that salty breeze, he felt a peace deeper and more real than any security money had ever promised him.